But I do remember asking people on the medical side, kind of off the record, at Duke and elsewhere. Duke's huge medical facility, like at Johns Hopkins, right? Some of these places, they're schools, but they have huge medical facility. And I said, you guys don't believe this is science, do you? And he said, off the record? I said, yeah, off the record. He said, it's not science at all. And I said, so why are you advocating it publicly? Because you'd get these emails saying the medical center at Duke has told us blah, blah, blah. You must do this. And they get their marching orders from the CDC. You see what I mean? So they were just like mouthpieces for the CDC. And he said he wouldn't tell me more, this person. He said, but it wasn't the sign. Then I said, then why? And he said, look up the money, follow the money. That was it.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.
Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 377. And we're talking again with Richard Salsman. Richard's been on before. He's at Duke. He also does some investment consulting, and he teaches economics, and he knows he's read the Federalist Papers. He knows a lot about Ayn Rand. He's definitely been one of the good guys over the years. How are you, Richard?
Very nice of you. Very kind, Chris. Thank you very much. Glad to be on the show again. I think the last time we talked about Alexander Hamilton, and I was defending.
Yes, we did. You had some good articles. That was an interesting defense.
And within objectivism, that's a faux pas. You're supposed to be pro Jefferson all the way and hate Hamilton. Anyway,
they did not like each other.
That's true.
Hearing good arguments. You know, I had Dave Benner on, and he talked about his bio of Thomas Paine. I haven't found a good Jeffersonian scholar yet to have on here. And regrettably, David Mayer is gone, so he would have been outstanding. Yeah,
great.
Yeah, great guy. There's some other ones out there too. But so Richard, you know, we were going to talk about, you know, what's going on with the right wing right now, because they seem to be, and of course, you know, we're about 5 weeks removed from the shooting of Charlie Kirk, which I think is really well. They already seemed like they were going a little crazy before then, but now they're even more so, and there's some understanding as to why. But what's your take on all this?
Well, first, since you mentioned Kirk, I don't want to just bypass that. I know I wanted to talk mostly about what I call the conservatism in conflict, and I had some great stuff for you. But let me just say this about Kirk, and especially me being at the university. I've been in university life now almost 15 years, having spent 25 years on Wall Street. What an eye opener! And so I'm aware. So I've been totally aware of what TPUSA has been doing. I've spoken at their events. I've spoken at their events, advocating objectivism as the basis of capitalism. That's how ecumenical they were. They were very good. They still are that good. And I never met Charlie directly, but I'm with the Atlas Society, and the president, Jennifer Grossman, has met him. He said to her, Atlas Shrugged was one of his favorite books. So he certainly was not an objectivist. He's very religious. But anyway, that murder, so symbolic, so particularly focused on getting him in public, in his venue, in front of people, taking tough questions. You know, the beginning of the tour he was going to do. It's so symbolic. Now, I'm not saying that sociopath was, really smart, but when we could talk about it, all what I call the targeting, all the hate. And I don't mind hate speech is perfectly free speech, but it does induce sociopaths to do these kind of things. It's so symbolic of what they're aiming at. They're aiming at, particularly, it's not just conservatism. I mean, if I were famous enough, or any objectivist or any libertarian was famous enough or influential enough as Charlie, and had that kind of reach and was on that many campuses, they would have been murdered as well. So I think what it is they cannot stand. Who's they? The anti-capitalist, nihilist, Antifa, these wackos, they hate anything resembling a right-wing argument that loves America, say loves the Constitution, say loves free market, which Charlie always said he did. And not just that they're influencing the young, which means the future. And then also this movement, TPUSA, was probably going to produce, might still, but I don't know, a future politician, a future statesman, maybe even Kirk. So it's absolutely disgusting. And then you could add to this, disgusting enough, but then the reactions, those who applauded it, those to this day who say good, or those who said, too bad the assassin versus Trump missed, is very indicative of what we're dealing with today and what the right is dealing with. If by Chris, if you mean in the aftermath of that, the memorial down in Austin and other things that they're really from that side promoting the Jesus talk, I agree with you that in my view, that is not going to help the right. I know they think it helps the right, but we can talk about that. But that's my take on that. Here's my broader take, which is a little more philosophical, and take this where you want. I'm in the middle of writing a long piece on the conservative movement, and I've identified 7 versions of conservatism that the conservatives are now talking about. And you could look at this from the standpoint of they're all messed up and they're all splintered and they're all like angry with each other and talk. On the other hand, you could say this is a vibrant, debating. They write books, they have conferences, they write statements and principles. So on the good side, I'm glad this movement is talking within itself and trying to figure out what it should be. Because the problem, as Ayn Rand identified in 1960 in her Princeton speech, conservatism and obituary, she said the problem, and that was before Goldwater lost the that's landslide in 60.
Yes.
She said, what are they trying to conserve? I asked conservatives that all the time on campus. I said, I sympathize with you leaning right, if that means leaning toward capitalism, but you guys won't use the word capitalism. You use the word free enterprise instead. You're shying away from it. She noticed that as well. And then she said, what are you actually trying to conserve? And unless you start naming the principles, and if you do, if you say something like Americanism, then defend Americanism. If it's constitutional government, then defend that. So here's the 7 I've identified, which some people have heard of before. But okay, ready? Neocon, Paleocon, Tradcon, PopCon, NatCon, FreeCon, and CompCon. All right, let me tell you what those are short for. By the way, these names are used by other people. I just took them off
Yes.
the reading list. All right, neo just means new. We can talk about who they are. Paleo sounds really old, right? But those are conservatives from the 40s, and they include people like Rothbard, who not that he was around in the 40s, but he advocates that. Tradcon means traditional conservatism. PopCon means populist conservative. NatCon means nationalist conservative. FreeCon, okay, this is closer to us. FreeCon means freedom conservatism. And the last one, which is actually old, you'll remember this, Chris, from the George W. Bush days, compassionate conservatism. Remember that? So I call that CompCon.
Yes.
And so here's my point. I have found in studying them that there's a lot of overlap, which you can talk about what the common themes are. But the fact that these are in their names, meaning that of the 4 or 5 main issues, that's their top issue. See what I'm saying? So a FreeCon would say, my top issue is freedom. And if you ask them, well, do you also want to break religion in? They'll say, yeah, but I don't want to lead with that. You know what I'm saying? And a TradCon is much, well, I want tradition above all else. I don't really care if we sacrifice a little freedom as long as we go by tradition and the Bible and stuff like that. So I wanted to get that out there in case, well, at least just to set the table for any of these you want to talk about, because I can go in depth. But my summary is, you could say these are schisms, and you could say it possibly weakens the movement in the sense of divide and conquer. But it's a hell of a lot more vibrant discussion and internal debate than is going on the left, I think. In the left, all you get is, should we be liberals? Okay, they're disappearing. I mean liberals in the sense of Bill Maher or the ones that are being hounded out of the party, or these leftist, anarchist, Antifa type nihilists. So they're dealing with a liberal philosophy that's not really liberal, a progressive philosophy that's actually against progress because they unite with the Greens, and versus nihilism. So that's nothing. There's nothing going on over there. So I tend to be a little more positive about this. And obviously, if they're going to debate whether they want the Bible over liberty or if they want theocracy over the founding fathers' constitutional system, we win that debate. But I think it's healthy. And on the right broadly, broadening it out, Chris, when I go to these events that I see students, what are the numbers? There are way more conservative students than libertarian students. And there are and there are way more libertarian students than objectivist students. So objectivism is a small piece of the pie. And so by sheer numbers alone, I think as an objectivist, my interest is in bringing to those other big groups arguments that would, as I said before, move them away from religion in the case of conservatism, and if possible, move them away from anarchy in the libertarian camp. So it's fun. It's fun to do. It's a big job, but I think it's much more intellectual than the other side.
Richard, that is one thing that has changed, though. You go back, to Russell Kirk,
Yeah.
William F. Buckley, and the George Roche types.
Yeah.
They were very hostile toward Ayn Rand.
Yes, they were. Yeah.
And now that I think Rush Limbaugh was pretty positive about Rand, and now it's at least now, hey, this Ayn Rand woman has some solid ideas.
Then the other one who says that is Mark Levin, who has a big following. So Mark Levin is quoted from the New Left, on her anti-environmentalism. I agree with that. And remember, famously, Buckley allowed Whittaker Chambers to review Atlas Shrugged in National Review, and this was only maybe 4 years after National Review began in 1955.
Yeah.
So right after the book came out in 1958, Whittaker Chambers, who was a former communist, and now, alleged conservative. By the way, I never trust those conversions. When someone says, I used to be a communist and now I'm a Catholic, or now I'm a conservative, I never trust that. But he came out with a book called, with a review, called Big Sister is Watching You. Not Big Brother is Watching You, from Orwell, and claiming that Atlas Shrugged was basically a case for fascism. And Bill Buckley allowed that and promoted it. Huh. You might think, like, with a fading influence, no big deal, but I think something on the 50th anniversary of that in 2008, National Review put it up again and basically said, here, we're reprising this wonderful essay. So they haven't apologized for doing that or anything like that with the passage of time. They reposted it. So yes, terrible. Mostly because of her case for unvarnished reason and secularism, and that's what they hate. But then she gets hate from the left because she's pro-capitalist. So that combination, by the way, there's not that many. I think Nozick is in this camp. James Buchanan is in this camp. There are very few. You could say maybe Mises, although it's hard to know. Right-wing, secular pro-capitalists. That Venn diagram, if you will, that combination is very rare. You know what I'm saying? You usually get pro-capitalism with religion, or you get, there's a left-wing religionist. So anyway, she's a rare combination, but that's why she gets it from all sides, because both sides hate that element of her. You probably know that.
Yeah, that's what bothers me, Richard, is as I'm now seeing among some conservatives a hostility toward the values of the Enlightenment, and there some of them have this attitude that neutrality leads to this, and I usually point out, I usually point out that the Enlightenment was Aristotelian, and all of this stuff all of this woke stuff is essentially Platonist.
Is essentially what?
Platonist.
Platon, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the
Or
counter.
maybe I should say Plato. Maybe I should say Platonic or Plato.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
I usually say Platonist, but that sounds like platelets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. The one exception. Well, there's probably more than one exception. I'm trying to name more popular figures. I could go with the academics, but nobody knows them. Ben Shapiro, who is Jewish, who is somewhat sympathetic to objectivism, but had clearly criticized it, and whose company, by the way, is contributing to a reissue of the movie of Atlas Shrugged, which is interesting, through the Atlas Society. He will say, I'm for the Enlightenment. And so will Mark Levin, who is also Jewish. And I think there's a common element there. There's something about, even though they're religious, there's something about the Jewish side of the conservative argument that is it's not only Old Testament, so it's much more willing to judge harshly, whereas the New Testament ones would not. Notice Erica Kirk forgave the murderer of her husband in public. Wow. And all the Catholics and Christian had said, what a noble thing that is. On the Jewish side, we would say, eye for an eye. We judge you harshly. This is justice, not mercy, that should apply. But so back to the Enlightenment. They also seem to be okay with the Enlightenment. They're still religious, but they're not as anti-Enlightenment as the Christian side. But I've definitely noticed that. I think the key figure here now here this is an academic, but he writes books that are widely read. Patrick Deneen, who was at Notre Dame, which is a Catholic university, who's a Catholic, is has written on this and is probably the most predominant on that side counter Enlightenment guy. And he's a political scientist in the department there. I'm just looking at some of the titles. The most famous, 2018, Why Liberalism Failed. Now, by liberalism, he doesn't actually mean, the welfare state democratic side. He uses liberalism in the old sense of the word, meaning pro-liberty. So he means classical liberalism, like the 19th century version, and what today he would call libertarianism. And he's not against it because of the anarchy side of that wing. He's against that limited government, monarchist libertarian wing. And he basically says, because it's anti-family, it's too individualist, it's too materialist, it's too much focused on, free markets and comforts and raising the standard of living. And then he'll say it's libertine. If you know the difference between libertarian or
Yes.
libertine, do whatever the hell you want, licentiousness, the whole thing. So it's all these caricatures of what it means to be free. And so he's denied. Now he's from the conservative side, and he has a big, big following. And this most recent book, which I think is so interesting, called Regime Change. You'd think that would be about foreign policy from 2023, but it's called Toward a Post-Liberal Future. So this is a blueprint he's got based on his prior ideas. And again, by liberal, he means pro-liberty. And so to move beyond liberty, and now here's a summary I got from the publisher, wants to replace the tyranny of self-serving elites with conservative leaders aligned with the interests of the working class, unquote. So every time I hear working class, Chris, I think, wow, this is like some Marxist screed, for the working class. And this is what Deneen is championing. I don't even know what that means, a government policy or a system geared to that. It sounds very secular, actually. It sounds very like get your hands dirty. But my thought always is, who is this working class? Like, I wonder if Elon Musk works a lot. I wonder if he's like one of the laborers. The man works 24 hours a day and creates like 6 different companies. And from the vision of what these people have, that's not working class to them. So this is an example of the populist appeal, where it's not just a religious appeal.
Yeah.
Anytime they say the elites are the problem, it's this populist idea of let me pander to the working class, on the working families in America. And this is supposed to be an erudite academic, and he's basically going all demagogue on us.
Yeah, that's true. I do think we have to acknowledge that we are having, we are seeing what is a dispossessed middle class. I mean, I know when I was born, I remember all the factories and all the plants around my area. None of them are there anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. I come from what would be, I'm both in Appalachia and the Rust Belt. So I've seen,
Well, you're straddling both. Oh, wow.
I mean, I was, I saw 420 students in my high school graduating class. That same high school graduates about 250 now. It's
Wow.
so it's not, and I think these people do just feel like what happened here. And I think a lot of times these people just want somebody to listen.
Yeah.
Somebody who and Trump tapped, and I'm not a fan of Robert Reich, but he called these people the anxious class.
Yeah.
And he even tried to rate, and this was geared toward lefts. He said, these people aren't racist. Don't call them racists. He said they're mostly good people, but they're just afraid of what's happening. And I think there's still a lot of that out there. And for whatever reason, Trump makes a lot of people less anxious, or when you take that anxiety away, it's very powerful.
Yeah, I think another way of looking at it from the psychology of it, I agree with you. And by the way, there's a huge mental health crisis, not only among youth, but even among seemingly privileged youth, like going to elite universities like I teach at. You would think they're all together and they're all with it and they're the cream of the crop. And intellectually, usually they are. But There's a phenomenon in the universities called accommodations.
Yeah.
And there's wholesale. This isn't unique to Duke. All the universities have it now. And they have accommodation offices. And here's the deal. You come in and you ask for special treatment of, taking longer to take tests, or taking tests in a more isolated environment, or, proper room temperature. You would not believe how detailed and bureaucratic they are. And, percentage of students in the class that, were accommodations 10 years ago, I don't know, maybe 3%, 5%. Now, 25%.
Yeah.
And I asked around, it's true in other universities and stuff. So, and suicide rates. So this problem of, I don't know, if you go deeper philosophically, especially in the objectivist literature, Edith Packer, Ayn Rand, especially Nathaniel Branden, who objectivists won't read anymore or cite anymore. The argument was self-esteem is all crucial. And it's not something that, as the conservatives say, it's not something that's pumped into you from without. You're great, you're amazing, you can do anything in life. That's not genuine self-esteem. He said it's based on, one, do I feel competent to live? And then, do I feel worthy of living? So the second one's more value oriented. But the first one is, unless you're confident in your mind, forget your body. Unless you're confident in your power to understand reality, you know what I mean? And use reason, and use it properly, and use the laws of logic, and then set the course of your life. I mean, just you tell this to a 13, 14, 15-year-old, they're going to have much better mental health. They're going to have self-esteem. They're going to be okay. They're not going to have mental health issues. But when they are taught the opposite, your mind is incompetent. Everything is stacked against you. America is inherently DNA racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic culture. Imagine and the planet's going to burn up. The environmentalists kick in. Such a malevolent, or often misanthropic take that the young students get, that's a problem. So Trump, you mentioned Trump responding to this. I think that's right to the extent he says MAGA. I have no problem with the phrase MAGA. You have to put some flesh on it. What does it mean? What does America mean in Make America Great Again? What does greatness consist of? Why again? In other words, can we look at the past and see models of when it worked well? I think we can, without bringing back the old racism and stuff like that. But there's an element of it also that says there's not actually enough finger pointing, in the sense of, well, hate to say it, but people have voted for this over the decades, and voted for the welfare state, the warfare state, the lawfare state, the state that's strangling the economy now and getting opportunities lost. Right. And who's the devil? The swamp. Well, they kind of are the devil, this fourth branch of government that both writes laws and compels people to follow them, but then also scapegoats like China's doing it. China is sending stuff to Walmart, and that's killing us. So there's a lot of that going on, which I don't think doesn't help. There needs to be more of a pro-capitalist answer to this. But I'm not one of these people in the objectivist movement who so hate Trump, or ridiculously think he's going to be a dictator. That's just ridiculous. But it's not fully pro-capitalist either. That's okay. We can just try to urge it to be so. Oh, by the way, I want to recommend a book, because you said, I like your phrase, the dispossessed middle class.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting phenomenon of when Marxism criticized capitalism. Remember, the argument was that the capitalist is exploiting the laborer. So anything the capitalists gain must have been by taking it out of the hides of the labor. And then it developed this whole animosity between rich and poor, which it was not a big leap from capitalist and labor. Now it's the rich and the poor. Then it was expanded to the first world versus the third world. Remember, the first world was prosperous because allegedly rape, robbing, and stealing from the third world. So that's just a version of the first antagonism. But it's been shown, by the way, that the more you build up the welfare state and the warfare state, this redistributive state, it doesn't go from rich to poor. Most of the transfers go, now get this, Chris, from middle class to middle class. I mean, the middle class is huge, of course. You couldn't possibly tax the rich to pay for, I don't know, maybe 4 weeks of the welfare of the government right now. And so there's this very interesting phenomenon that the middle class is asking for these programs, and in turn being forced to pay for them. And it doesn't help them in any way. I mean, it's one of the reasons why their opportunities for jobs, for advancement, for a better life are going down. And the best account I ever saw of this, I want to recommend a book, 2009. by Edgar Browning, Browning, and it's got a great title. It's called Stealing from Each Other. Isn't that apt? Stealing from each other. It's not really robbing the rich to pay the poor. He documents how, oh my gosh, what's actually happening is most of us are demanding a coercive redistributionist state because we think we're being like humanitarian or something like that. And out of the other pocket, it's being stolen from us. So it's a very insidious, terrible system. And yet in the background, when people want to hear, give me an explanation for why I'm stuck in the middle and I'm not going anywhere, they always bring out well, the rich are doing it to you. It's the rich versus poor and the same old antagonisms. But that's a good book documenting what's actually happened. Stealing from each other.
Yeah, there's a lot of that stealing from middle class, but yeah, I've never thought of that middle class stealing from middle class, but
that's what the numbers show. Like you can document where's the spending actually going, where the tax revenue is actually coming from. And, if you just did a bell curve, Chris, the standard normal distribution of bell curve, you got the tails are rich and poor, but most of the income and of course, most of the votes are in the middle. And those are the people who, represent the majority, and the majority is voting for bigger and bigger government in all these realms. And the only way to get the money is from the middle class. Willie Sutton years ago was asked, the bank robber, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. That was the name of it.
yeah,
And they say, why do you rob the middle class? Because that's where the money is.
that's true. That's where the money is. Yeah, why do you rob? Yeah, it's yeah. Why do you? That's why I don't think necessarily. And there have been, and we've had all this inflation over the last 54 years since the decoupling of the dollar from gold. I mean
Yeah.
That takes from the people who aren't politically connected to people who are politically connected. It's the best argument that a lot of gold bugs use is that in 1962 the minimum wage was equal to about 5 silver quarters.
Yes, and still is.
And that was an ounce of silver, and now what's an ounce of silver versus the minimum wage? It's
Oh, I see.
yeah, it's
Gold and silver hold their value, but people see the price of those things going up and they think, wow, those are volatile. No, the value of the dollar is going down. Yeah. If you need, as you do today, $4,000 to buy an ounce of gold, and you're right, when they went off the gold standard, it took $35, call it 40, to buy an ounce of gold. That's how much the dollar has lost. It used to be worth 1/40th of an ounce of gold. Now it's worth 1/4000th an ounce of gold. And the purchasing power in terms of what it buys in goods and services is, I don't know, something like 5% of what it was. So it's lost 95% of its value. My theory on this has been that I used to just believe, well, this is just mismanaged monetary policy, and this is what happens with central banking. And I've critiqued this in the past. I'll say central banking is but central planning applied to money and banking. So just history and theory tell us it's going to erode and ruin and debase both money and banking. Yes, because central planning does that to everything it touches, right? So that's true. But I'm also become aware more as I worked in public finance or on issues of public finance, how the government funds itself, that if the gargantuan welfare warfare state is growing, but people cannot be, politicians cannot tax people, especially the rich, to pay for it. And notice they don't say, oh, maybe we should stop expanding government because we can't pay for it. The next step is just borrow the difference and have the rich buy bonds, right? And then when that option runs out, what would the other option be? Print money, right? In which nobody would know what the hell is going on because it's not a tax. You're not feeling it directly. You're not even seeing the bonds issue. Nobody knows what the money supply is. You ask people, what's the money supply? And has it anything to do with the increase in prices? And that last one is not only insidious, you can blame it on price setters, or you can blame it on the grocer and the gas attendant, because why are you raising your prices? You're robbing me. And the politicians in Washington must laugh their heads off because they know they debase the money, and they debase the money to pay for the for the welfare warfare state. But it doesn't seem to pinch directly, right? People do not blame politicians for the inflation usually. Although I was impressed when Biden's inflation occurred, I was impressed at how little denunciation of business went on. I mean, Kamala Harris did say there was price gouging, remember? So that's the standard left Democrat view, is there's price gouging. And or Biden would blame like big beef or big egg. Anytime you want to do inflation, you just say big. Big is bad. Another populist take. Big is bad. Small is good. Working class. But generally, there was not the kind of 1970s maniacal blaming of oil companies and everyone else for inflation. So that's good. But people still don't relate it to a welfare state that cannot be financed without tax revolt by taxes alone. So that's why the country's going into fiscal ruin in slow motion, because it has this welfare warfare state which it cannot afford, so to speak, in the terms of taxes. So it's resorting to these other measures. And so the national debt now is 37 trillion, and the annual deficit now is a trillion just for the deficit, spending in excess of, and that's going to grow over time. And yes, we had this bout of inflation where it went up from 2 to 9, back down to 3 now, but 3 is a lot. And it has the prospects of going up to double digits over the next 10 years. So, yeah, democracy unlimited, put it this way, unlimited democracy, mob majority rule, leads to fiscal profligacy. It's just a natural connection. And people love democracy. They're not willing to criticize democracy. Some conservatives are, but they love the unlimited democracy. And if it votes the nation into bankruptcy, they don't seem to care.
That's why you do see some very anti-democratic elements out there, though. Somebody like, for example, Curtis Yarvin,
Yes.
who's not, I don't really know what he stands for. That's the thing. I don't really know what any of these people stand for. They know what they stand against, but they're not, and that's never a good thing. If you don't have a positive vision for where you're going and what you want to design,
Yes, agreed.
it's not going to end well.
That has been a common element of conservatism. I think it's the nature of a system that you want to conserve. You like the status quo. You tend to resist change. That kind of thing will mean that you're against rather than for. Bill Buckley famously used to say, I stand athwart history and say, stop. What? Stop history is ridiculous. History doesn't stop. There's new history folding all the time. So yes, this is an example of what I said before about what is it conserving. If it's just conserving whatever the foes put in place over the last 2 decades, which has been the history, then it's a total moving target. It's the complete opposite of the brand that conservatism seems to have. If you say to someone, I'm a conservative, they'll say, wow, they used to call them rock-ribbed conservatives, stick in the mud, they resist all change and everything. No, they consolidate the change that other side makes, whether Marxism or modern liberalism. I think back, Chris, to you look at the history of big interventions that got rid of capitalism over time. The antitrust laws, 1890, that was passed by conservatives because they believed the Marxist myth that if you leave the competition system alone, they'll all be monopolies. But everything from the income tax, 1913, the Federal Reserve, 1913, the Great Society, the New Deal programs of the 30s, Social Security, the Medicare and Medicaid programs of the 1960s and onward, Obamacare. In each case, the conservatives, what were they doing? They wanted to conserve what was in place at the time, and they opposed the new intervention. But if you ask them all now, ask them all right now, ask the conservatives, are you against the antitrust laws? No. Are you against the income tax? No. Are you against the Fed, Medicare, Medicaid, the SEC, the EP? They're not against any of it, right? Which means they're reactive. I mean, the true word is reactionary. Yeah, and I think objectivism is unique because it's advocating capitalism, a positive. I mean, it has critiques of these other anti-capitalisms, but it's not largely that. It's making a case for reason, egoism, individualism, many things that conservatives do not like. Capitalism, unvarnished, unapologetic. It's well known, by the way. You remember in the 60s and 70s, the Buckley and the conservatives, they would be anti-liberal, or they'd be anti the media. They're very much like that even today. Or they'd be anti-communist. Okay, well, Ayn Rand was anti-communist. She wasn't against being
Yeah.
anti, right? But notice they were mostly anti-thing. And interestingly, when those things went away, or when they were severely diminished, the conservatives were left with, we got nothing here. We got nothing here to go against. Do you remember when Dukakis ran against Bush Sr. in '88? They used to call it the L word, because liberalism in its modern form had been so bad that by the late '80s, and of course Reaganomics helped in this, they didn't want to call themselves liberal. It was literally the L word, like it was the F word. And
Yeah.
so like the conservatives thought they won, but the government's bigger and more invasive than ever. And same thing when the Soviets fell. You could say the same thing. You could say, "Ah, we've won. We were anti-communist. Communism has failed." But they look around like, "Now what are we gonna do? Are you gonna implement capitalism?" "No, we're not gonna implement capitalism. You're just gonna what are you gonna we need something else to be against." So the next step was the media, but when they started Fox, when Fox started in what, '96? Now they had their own network. They have developed their own magazines and options and things like that. Good for them. And but you're right, Chris, to the extent they're still anti, it doesn't have any oomph. It doesn't have any movement to it that can build up something like objectivists would endorse, like a fully free society, vibrant, individualist, capitalist.
Yes. Well, that's like a tweet just recently from Christian Hines, who was on a show with Nick Freitas, and he's been on my show a few times. This is his quote, "I'd rather lose," end of inside quote. "We know that's all conservatives have ever done. Lose. After progressives win a cultural or institutional battle, conservatives stop fighting, and begin conserving the new normal as part of their tradition. Conservatism operates as the final legitimizer of every leftist victory." End of quotation.
That's a good quote. The legitimizer part. Yeah, I liken it sometimes to suppose an army is moving forward and taking
Yes.
territory. So they're moving forward and taking territory, right? But I'm not a military strategist, but I understand there's this element where once you take the territory, unless you kind of slow down, stop, and consolidate your gains, as a new platform for the next blitz or whatever, that it's useless to just keep marching and marching and marching without consolidating. You could think of conservatives as doing that. They're the ones they're not marching ahead down the road to serfdom, but every little stop that creates, an illiberal institution, they backfill and consolidate and confirm after the fact. The most recent case, obviously, is Obamacare, right? Trump came in 2016 saying, "I'm going to repeal Obamacare." And then who cast the vote that made that impossible? John McCain. John McCain and Lindsey Graham, because they hated Trump, so they cast the vote, and we have Obamacare. I mean, that's not the only reason we have Obamacare, but and here's the key, as you put it, where was the Republican plan to replace it with something? I don't mean replace it with another government program. I mean, free up the health insurance industry. And so there's so many controls and so many subsidies that make the current healthcare system bad. Nothing to do with capitalism. They didn't do it because they're not reformers. But Chris, by the way, I found this same difficulty in the libertarian movement, and it goes something like this: the libertarians are saying we're for laissez-faire, hands off. And I'm like, "Okay, so am I." And then they say, "And the state sucks. We're against the state." Now that's the more anarchist element. And I'll say something like, "Well, not all states suck. If we keep them constitutionally bound, that could be a good state." So the libertarians tend to equate state with statism. In other words, they can't imagine any state that doesn't actually eventually become statist. Jefferson said that even. He said, "Liberty always yields and tyranny always gains. So you have to have a revolution every 20 years."
Yeah.
But I've been with libertarians and I'll say, because I have this I say, "I have a plan to phase out and phase out the Fed and replace fiat money and central banking with the gold standard and free banking. It's in my 1990 book. It's the epilogue to my book is here's how you dismantle the Fed safely, quickly. And I've done the same thing with Social Security. I have a plan out there how to phase out Social Security pretty much without harming anybody, which is hard to believe. And I've had libertarians say, we wouldn't advocate that. And I'll say, why? They'll say, because the government would have to do something. Can you imagine? So even libertarians consolidate these gains by saying, we'll try to resist these reforms and these radical intrusions, but we got nothing to unwind it. We got nothing we have no plan because we're against planning. Isn't that bizarre? It makes it impossible to win if the gains are all from the other side.
Well, as I was saying, when it's interesting too, watching conservatives fight Obamacare, they would often just say things like, well, he wasn't, well, his birth certificate is fake. I mean, that was their argument. And that's not an argument. And I would say to him, well, okay, what about Bush care, Clinton care, Reagan care, Nixon care, and Johnson care? Are you going to get rid of those too?
Right.
By
the way, apropos that, remember they used to call it Reaganomics. I don't even like the whole idea of naming programs, whether they're good or bad. Reaganomics was good. That was supply side economics or Obamacare. Notice that as you lose liberty and as the state becomes more powerful and invasive in our lives, that you get this kind of cult of personality. Why would you call it Obamacare? Like it's uniquely Obama's thing. Now he did promote it and advocate it, right? But it's called the Affordable Care Act, which makes it unaffordable. But that phenomenon itself, quite apart from the Democrats coming up with things like the New Deal and New Frontier and the Great Society, they love labeling. They're very good at branding. They love labeling and branding their programs, which the Republicans notice do not do. But that's a sign of statism. That's a sign of cult of personality. Obamacare. I've never liked that. But notice how the Republicans handled Obamacare. They had already endorsed Medicare and Medicaid, right? Not in 1965. Then they opposed it. But once it was in place, now they're for it, right? So Obama comes along Obama comes along in 2008 and says, well, we already have Medicare and Medicaid. I just want to extend it. And why would you be against that? Because you're not against the existing programs. I'm just extending it. Or when George W. Bush did that, George W. Bush in 2000 heard Al Gore say, we need to add pharma drugs to the Medicare benefits. And Bush said, we can't afford that. And then he started dropping in the polls. And then Bush W. said, yeah, I want that too. So when Bush was elected in 2003, they put pharma drugs in Medicare. And pharma drug prices started skyrocketing, as everything does that government subsidizes. And now Trump is trying to put in pharma price control, which will lead to shortages. I mean, this is old stuff. This happens over and over and over again. That was an example of the conservatives and Mr. Compassionate Conservative Bush aping what the other side does. When Obama said, here's the other difference, Chris. The other side will name their end spot. They'll name their goal. So Obama will say, I want full socialized medicine. He didn't use that word. He said, I want a single payer. I want single payer universal healthcare, which is another way of saying government will be the single payer. This is the one case where monopoly is especially very good. All economists hate monopoly, but in the economy. But if the government is the monopolist, that's supposed to be okay. And the Republicans come along and say, oh, let's split the difference. Let's compromise. Instead of saying your goal is evil, your goal is vicious. We do have socialized medicine in the world we can point to. It's awful. And not just for patients. They always go that route. For providers, for doctors, for pharma companies, for hospitals, they will never defend, notice, the providers because they're like rich elites. Doctors, surgeons, hospital, pharma companies, they don't want to defend any of those. So they go all populist and say, well, if we're against socialized medicine at all, it's only because it hurts the patients. Well, of course it hurts the patients because it hurts the providers. So I don't know. These are some of the, it's an example of some of the appeasement that the conservatives will bring, and they're not, that's why they don't win. But Chris, I think we should realize they don't really want to win in the sense of their goal is not capitalism in the sense that you and I believe, right? They do want the mixed system, I think. They just don't want it to go fast. They want like there to be speed bumps on the way to this mixed system, welfare warfare state. Interestingly, because one of the great conservatives of all time, Hayek, in 1944, Road to Serfdom said his theme was you can't play with mixed systems because the mixture that's socialist will cause problems and the controls will breed problems. And then the response will be more controls. And so his theme was it's a bias toward more and more government intervention. And yet, in the road to in the Constitution of Liberty, 1960, he wrote, he basically advocated that mixed system. So it's odd because, like, knowing the mixed system, and I think that's true, goes in the direction of the poison that's in the system, not the nutrition, the socialist element, not the capitalist element. Well, then why in 1960 didn't he advocate, a purer system of capitalism? Why did he feel the need, probably philosophy, maybe pragmatism, wanting to be relevant, to go that route, which was defying his theme from 16 years earlier?
Yeah, that's certainly, just recently it reminds me of, somebody wrote a nice article about Margaret Thatcher's 100th birthday. And I just responded to that, really, okay, I there were certainly good aspects of Margaret Thatcher, but I just said to him, this country was on a suicide course. She may have put the brakes on it, but
Right.
it just continued on a suicide course. And being a non-interventionist, I now just say to those people, my dad had a lot of first cousins who fought to save your butts 80 years ago.
Yes.
I now can see that that was a mistake.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that because I gave a talk one time on World War II and Ayn Rand's famous point about we never should have entered World War II. We should have let the Nazis and Soviets just go at each other and then take care of the winner, vanquish the winner. But Thatcher famously said, I'm a big fan of Thatcher too, as I was with Reagan, but I see the same issue with both. Namely, you notice they were both older. They had been in politics for quite a while. They were both pretty much self-taught. They didn't get it from universities. And they came in, and yes, in the case of the UK, she first, and then followed by him, tried to mostly stop the decay, and thankfully won the Cold War without a mushroom cloud. So she famously said that. But yeah, they can only go so far, I think, because they're conservative. But even if they were libertarian or objectivists like us, you have this problem with an electorate does not really want that. So what do you do? And she famously said a couple of things I would name that just premise wise, conservatives should not do. She said something like the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. Notice that angle. It's unfortunate, like, if you somehow couldn't run out of other people's money, it would be okay. How about it's just wrong to steal money from people?
Yes.
No, it's not just, well, it's impractical. You run out of people's money. Yeah, but guess what they do, Maggie? After that, they borrow it and they print it. You know what I'm saying? I just went through this earlier when you can't tax anymore. So you don't ever run out of people's money. I mean, the modern what is it called? Modern monetary theory, MMT? Which is like
Yes.
all the talk a couple of years ago. What was the argument? That other side was saying, "We don't have to tax people. We'll just print money for whatever we need." And thinking that's not gonna lead to inflation, or we can just borrow it. We don't have to tax people. There's price no limit, and interest rates won't go up. We'll just borrow as much as we want. But Thatcher's phraseology there is accepting the premise of, well, you can rob people. You can rob Peter to pay Paul, but make sure you don't run out of money from Peter. And here's another example of that. Rush Limbaugh used to say this all the time, but conservatives say this all the time. Socialism doesn't work. You ever hear that one? You hear that all the time. Socialism doesn't work. I think that is a deadly concession to the other side, for the following reason. What are they saying it doesn't do? It doesn't deliver prosperity. Check. True, it doesn't. It doesn't deliver peace. It's very warlike. There's
Yeah.
something in the literature called the capitalist peace or the democratic peace, showing that free countries tend not to attack each other. And Ayn Rand pointed this out in The Roots of War in the early 60s. So it doesn't deliver that. It doesn't deliver security in the sense of social security. And okay, so it doesn't, and that's what they mean. But notice what they're saying. They think that's what socialists intend, and they're just stupid. These poor socialists, they don't know how to deliver peace and peace and prosperity. So it doesn't work. I mean, see what they're conceding? They're conceding. This is after 100 years, Chris.
Yeah.
This is not 1916 where they haven't seen the Soviet experiment yet.
Yeah.
And some rube is saying, let's go socialist. You now have 125 years or 110 years, say, 25 experiments. It's awful. At one point, do we say this is exactly what the socialists want? They want impoverishment. They want tyranny. They're anti-human. They're not humanitarians trying to liberate the workers.
Yeah.
Maybe I give you that in 1916, but not after this, not after all this track record. And yet the conservatives are still saying they want the best for us. They really do. They want peace and prosperity, but their system doesn't work. I guess we need to tutor them more and then teach them supply and demand curves. See how pathetic that is? It's pathetic.
Yeah. I don't think,
Letting them off.
Richard, also, as you pointed out earlier, you talked about, a lot of rich kids end up becoming socialist. And I had a talk with a guy named Andy Oliveron, who was very familiar with Colombia. He actually knew people in Pablo Escobar's family. And he told me, he said, down in Colombia, rich kids will join the drug cartels. And it's because they want something that is their own, because people are always telling them, well, you were just able to do that because you were rich.
Yeah.
And they don't develop a sense of accomplishment, which is something I think is absolutely necessary for kids to have. And this is what I don't hear objectivists talk much about this very much, but this is why I'm so very much, in favor of what, is now called free range kids.
Right. Yeah.
When you have kids who are, I think I might have went to the library in my hometown when I was 6 years old by myself.
Yeah.
And
now,
yes,
now a parent can get arrested.
yeah. And now, that
Yeah.
is just so ridiculous. And I don't know what puts a stop to it. And Richard, some of this stuff I don't think really was ever voted for. I don't think people ever voted for stuff like that. I don't think it was just coming down out of these social workers and all these other people being trained on how to do things. It's really the whole thing about free range kids is probably ultimately a reason why I often just say to people, just get out of America and go someplace else, because it's not that way elsewhere. But
I love that. I love that phrase, because we think of free range chickens. Yeah, I guess if you plotted this over the last 50 years, you'd say the chickens went from being cooped up, literally. That's what coop means. And the kids were free range. You and I were running around the neighborhood, and the only admonition was come back when the lights are on. When the street lights are on. And get home for dinner, and don't run on the traffic or whatever. And you learn stuff, and you negotiate with kids. You're in the ball game, and there's no referees. Remember that one? You got to call your own balls and strikes. So it taught integrity, and and if you lie about it, they just take their balls and go home, and then you end the game and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So the chickens became free range, and the kids became cooped up. I sound like an old fuddy-duddy now. I'm 66, but I look at the gamers. Oh my God. I totally skipped that. I don't know. I missed the whole gamer thing. I've never played a game in my life. These, Mortal Kombat and all these things, and people who play these for hours on end in their mother's basement, and they're just not equipped to. I like social media, and I like I'm not one of these Luddites. I do like technology. I love AI. I love everything automated, robot. Give me more, give me more, give me more. But people do have to be taught with how to use these tools. You know what I mean? And not become a tool of the tools, I guess would be something like that. And that takes coaching. I would say this, though, about you say they're not voting for it. I don't know. I think they are voting for it. I mean, especially these democratic systems, the majority is voting for these programs. And so minorities might not agree with it, but they get outvoted. That's why I'm against unlimited democracy and most objective.
Well, certainly, I think part of talking about free range kids is just because I wonder how many people who have kids are making these phone calls and having cell phones. Unfortunately, I think is a big part of it, because anybody can get to a phone immediately now. It wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I have said. I said, if we are ever going to bring back free range kids or have a society of free range kids, we've got to have payphones out there, because I always had access to a payphone.
Yeah.
So if we really did need to call mom and dad, we could
Yeah.
Find somebody, a sympathetic adult might give us 10 cents and when it was 10 cents and, we'll make that.
Isn't there a movement back to flip phones or something like that where the parents are giving the kids, so the flip
Yeah.
phone, you can still text me and call me, but you can't access the internet with this phone. I think there's a movement back to that. Chris, what's his name? Jonathan Haidt. I think it's
Yes, Jonathan Haidt, yeah.
H-A-I-G-H-T up at NYU.
Haidt, yes. He's right about a lot of these things.
He's a social psychologist, something like that. I've written a lot about take the phones away. The kids are being tortured, are being mentally impaired by the. I know I wouldn't go so far as him, but I was in a seminar the other day leading Duke students, and I asked we were talking about AI automation, and I asked them, and they started talking about it very, very actively. That when did you first get a cell phone, and what was your parents' policy? And some of them said 12, 13 years old. Some of them said never. They never were, until they got into college or something like that. So there's all these different approaches that have been taken, but I don't know. I'm not as against that stuff as much. Here's another thing I would say though, Chris, and this goes way back, and something that conservatives are maybe good on, but not fully. I've often likened the school system in America, and I don't think this is true of every other system out there in the world. Marx famously said that socialism is public ownership and control of the means of production. And I mean, a socialist today would say that's what it is. That's how AOC would define it. That's how Sanders would define it, or the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, right? Okay, how about this? Even though the Soviets fell, even though we're supposedly socialism failed, we still have in America public ownership and control of the means of instruction, not production, schools. And why that would be able to, escape the same problems of socialism. But here, instead of ruining tangible capital like plant and equipment that public ownership of the means of production would do, they're destroying human capital. They're eroding human capital, which economists define as, kids' ability to think. Your human capital is the skills you have, the knowledge you have, the experience you have, the credentials you have. It was defined by Gary Becker in the 70s and 80s. Human capital, very neat concept, but it's being destroyed and eroded. And it's like they're mass producing voters who are illiterate, innumerate, don't know history, yet asked to vote, yet encouraged to vote.
Yeah.
Easily pandered to, the demagogue just treats them as clay, does whatever they want with them, knowing they're not knowledgeable. And notice, Chris, also each side, to be bipartisan about this, if someone elects Obama, the conservatives say, the guy's an idiot. He was in the Senate for 2 years. Who knows what his college grades were? He won't release them. Looks like he got through the Harvard Law Review with, affirmative action. Blah, blah, blah. And look at him. He's a socialist, pretended to be a uniter, and instead divided us and tried to put in socialized medicine, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then Trump gets in, and what does the other side say? He's an idiot. He knows nothing about politics. He's just a buffoon, and he's just but neither side steps back and says, "Oh my, there's something wrong with this democratic system of ours." It's percolating up some of the, if you believe either side, some of the less than the best and the brightest. How is that possible? How's that possible? Because we don't have a constitutionally limited government anymore that just does a few things, right, and a few things well. Now it does dozens of things badly. Right, because it's not proper. It shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a Department of Education, energy, transportation. There's 14 of them, right? 14, 15 of them. Government overseeing some sector of the economy. Just terrible. But I've often said the bigger sweep of history, and it used to be Vox Dei, the voice of God. And right, we had kings, we had the divine right of kings.
Yes.
Monarchs who said, I get to be a monarch because God speaks through me, or my family and my bloodlines, the House of Windsor, or remember that kind of stuff. And then, interestingly, for the brief period during the Enlightenment, 1700s, part of the 1800s, it was you could say vox intellentia, the voice of reason. And John Locke specifically, in the first treatise on government, said, no, there's no such thing as divine right of kings. Second treatise lays out, well, what is the legitimate base of government? And it's not divine. it's rational and it's based on reason. The whole argument. That's why it's so famous, including a case for private property in chapter 5, right? So,
Yeah.
but when that went away, here's what's interesting, Chris. Here's what we have today. When Vox Dei went away, not going to be the voice of God, and then Vox Intellentia went away. We have this counter enlightenment, not going to go by reason anymore. It's Vox Populi, voice of the people. Alexander Hamilton was starting even in the founding period, voice of the people. And Hamilton famously said, people think that Vox Populi means Vox Dei. People think the voice of the people is the new voice of God. And he said, no, it's not. No, it's not. Neither of them are legitimate basis for sovereignty and liberty. Amazing. But conservatives have that populist side of conservatives when they're like too embarrassed to say do it because the Bible said. They'll say do it because the people want it. And notice in neither case are they invoking reason or facts or science. They're invoking, one supernatural voice and the other one a collectivist one.
That seems to be what they fight over, or they try to, or they call it science, but really it's not just science at all. It's just something that they claim is science. We've kind of strayed away from the whole issue of conservatives, but I do find it interesting. For example, we're talking about Curtis Yarvin. Is that Yarvin was actually in February declared the end of globalism because of the big bad coronavirus. I mean, this is one thing that the right now wants to completely forget happened. Is it was the right wing that was promoting the coronavirus mainly to demonize international trade and just international travel. They all just wanted us to be in our own little enclaves. And I remember Ezra Levant of Rebel News up in Canada was saying, well, Trudeau hasn't shut down flights yet, and just, they scaremongered about this, and then it ended up blowing up in their faces. But
I like that. Yeah, I like that take. I hadn't realized that it was used to be anti-globalist. I mean, I guess COVID did cross borders. So lots of things cross borders. My only nod to conspiracy theory, which I don't really like conspiracy theories, but I thought I would just chime in with Trump. Demonizes the first Trump first term demonizes China and its dastardly imports. And so he's going to block imports of stuff that would end up on the shelves of Walmart and everything. So my joke is not really a joke. So instead, China exports the virus to us and ruins your presidency and reveals your authoritarian leanings, because he really did go totally authoritarian. He not only emboldened Fauci and Birx and all the people, remember, standing behind him at the podium every morning. Every morning he would do this, and the white coats would come out, and he would turn it over to them and let them do whatever the hell they want, including run roughshod over the country. And that was his mistake. That was a terrible mistake. And he invoked the War Powers Act of 1945 or something like that, when Truman stole the steel industry for $1 to work during the war and stuff like that. Trump invoked that. I think it was the Defense Production Act. That's what it was called, 1950, during the Korean War. So, and the lockdowns and stuff like that. I remember, Chris, at the time being shocked. The conservatives are one thing, but the libertarians, who really should have been against this as violation of civil liberties and property rights, were crickets. They were very silent, I noticed. And I to this day, I'm not even quite sure why. And then within my movement, if you want to call it that, I got in trouble among objectivists because I was criticizing the lockdowns, and I was criticizing COVID, and I was criticizing Trump for this. And so interestingly, because many objectivists today, and since he came in, are so anti-Trump for being an alleged authoritarian, the one or two cases where he is an authoritarian on trade, just unilaterally imposing tariffs, and on COVID, those are the two cases where these objectivists were excusing him and saying, well, maybe there's some justification to it. Unbelievable inconsistency. And so, I got in fights with objectivists about that, ARI particularly. They did not like me, and they were all for imposing the vaccines on people and lockdowns and things like that. I don't think they still have not apologized for it. But I was consistent throughout. In my book, by the way, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? That came out in 2021. We were still in the middle of some of the COVID stuff. And there's chapters in there from 2020, essays from 2020 in spring when it broke out, where I was saying, don't do this, don't do these lockdowns. And one of the essays was called "Unhealthy is Unwealthy." In other words, it's gonna if you're shutting down the economy, that hurts people,
Yes.
and that's dangerous to their health. And there's suicide, and there's drinking, and there's domestic abuse that goes on, and all these contextual things that people couldn't project for some reason as liberties were being violated. I could see them. I mean, I'm no Nostradamus, but some of that stuff was pretty basic to me. Don't print money, send people home, lock them down, treat them like prisoners, violate their civil liberties. Unbelievable. And Greens at the time, remember the environmentalists at the time were literally looking up in the skies and in their measurements and saying, look how little CO2 is going up into the air. This is a wonderful experiment. Maybe in the future we can name climate change as an emergency and shut down the economy for that. This is not going to go away. I mean, these people have not, in retrospect, there's been no, have you noticed, Chris, any mea culpas at the end, or let's reassess this, or Fauci the other day said, oh, we're going to get another virus. I mean, that's just an obvious thing. We're going to get another, and nobody asked him, you going to apply the same policies? When we get this other virus, you're going to do the same thing, or are you going to say no? No, he would do the same thing. He would do the same thing. Why that man is not in jail? He is like the Mengele of our day. The Joseph Mengele, the guy who
Yeah, Joseph Mengele, yeah.
Nazi camps would work on people and disfigure Jews and shit like that. I mean, that is Fauci. He when he was in that government position, he funded the Wuhan lab stuff. He and a guy at UNC, Peter
Yeah.
Brad, whatever his name is, and
You
still
know,
not held accountable for that. One of the highest paid government officials. Just think of this like 10 years ago, if someone says to you, 10 years hence, one of the highest paid government officials will stick US government taxpayer money into a lab in China that is trying to supercharge a lethal virus. And then it gets out and all this carnage occurs and he's still a celebrity.
yeah.
He's still on time. I don't know if anyone could believe that, but that's what happened. Unbelievable.
Richard, it really was something that I will never figure out. And there were a few brave people though, and we were apparently just enough to at least turn things back. I mean,
Yeah.
you were there, Jeffrey Tucker.
This was great. Yeah, I worked with Jeff on that at AIR, Barrington, the Great Barrington. I'm associated with them.
Yeah, they were.
Tucker
Jeffrey was calling it out from day one. I mean,
He was.
yeah, as much as
By the way, Chris, those essays I cited
Yeah.
that I against early on, Jeff was the editor
Yeah.
at AIR when I submitted. He didn't touch a word that I wrote, maybe fixed a typo here and there. Jeff was the editor up at AIR when I was submitting those essays. He was fabulous. He was great. And I was using some of his stuff. He was using some of mine. Then the Great Barrington Declaration. And
Yeah.
anyone who signed the Great Barrington, that's where AIR is, American Institute for Economic Research. They're in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I've been affiliated with them since 1990. Anyone who signed that was also blacklisted.
Yeah.
Bhattacharya and others. And to Trump's great credit, he put most of them in positions. The ones that signed that declaration and then were canceled or ostracized, he's got them at the CDC and NIH and elsewhere. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, there were a few other people who Larkin Rose was really good. The people that I would call the extreme, the good anarchists, they were all really good on it. But there were various factions. Yeah,
because they're going to be against anything the state does.
And Ron Paul and the Mises Institute, and it eventually ended up raising the profile of these people, and the other people were just asking what happened.
I'll tell you another, it's kind of an inside story, but it's publicly known, so I'm not really giving away anything. There was a behind the scenes, very interesting, bizarre aspect to it from the standpoint of the science. And I would say masking, that's not science. Distancing, that's not science. This idea of once you get the vaccine, you can never, get it again. That was not true. I did like the fact that he fast track some of the stuff, but it doesn't at the FDA. That doesn't matter. Here's what I experienced. This was true. A lot of people at work. I was working at Duke. I could not step on campus unless I proved that I had the vax. I didn't want to get the vax. I didn't want to get this disease. I was older. I was a bit overweight. And I was in this category that might be at risk. So, I did get it anyway, and immunity alone fought it off. So I survived it pretty well. And but I couldn't get on campus unless I did this, right? And I remember asking, and that was true of all the students and stuff. And I thought it was authoritarian, but it's a private company. It's a private university, so I can't. I have to make my decision, right? But I do remember asking people on the medical side, kind of off the record, at Duke and elsewhere. Duke's huge medical facility, like at Johns Hopkins, right? Some of these places, they're schools, but they have huge medical facility. And I said, "You guys don't believe this is science, do you?" And he said, "Off the record?" I said, "Yeah, off the record." He said, "It's not science at all." And I said, "So why are you advocating it publicly?" Because you'd get these emails saying the medical center at Duke has told us blah blah blah. You must do this, and they get their marching orders from the CDC. You see what I mean? So they were just like mouthpieces for the CDC. And he said he wouldn't tell me more. This person, he said, but it wasn't the sign. And I said, then why? And he said, look up the money, follow the money. That was it. He didn't say anything more. So I looked up how much government money goes to Duke Medical. Billions, billions. It's on a list. You can look up the list. The biggest university recipients of government money for medical research. Hopkins number 1, Duke number 2. You see the logic? Like, can you imagine if Duke Medical had come out with some kind of universal argument saying this is bullshit. This is not science, and here's why. Because we're the scientists here. They, I think, would have risked getting funding.
Yeah,
That's not good. That's not objectivity. That's government not involved in the schools, government heavily involved in research, and you can't speak the truth because you're going to lose funding. On a certain level, you can see why people wouldn't want to lose their funding, but then they lose their free speech and their objectivity. That partly happened during COVID.
I think more and more nowadays about how many people out there don't speak up because they're afraid of losing their funding, and I'm afraid it's a lot. And I'm afraid, Richard, I think a lot of these conservative influencers are just doing Gail line, and they put out stuff that they think's going to be popular, and then they see if it works. Orrin McIntyre, who I think knows better, once commented, well, if we just get rid of, get these immigrants out of here, we'll have a functional healthcare system. And I'm like, what? It's like you suddenly forgot about all these other problems. And as somebody else pointed out to me, not to mention, considering that most of these immigrants are in their 20s and 30s, those are not the largest consumers of healthcare.
Right. I know. Right.
But they make these.
And often they don't want to go into the system because they might get tagged.
Yeah, and some of them were even going as far as saying we want to tax remittances. So if, you have that Mexican who's making a lot of money in America and then sends money. Well, we want to tax the money he sends back to his family. I don't know how you're going to do that, but it's like, but we'll just.
Well, back to conservatism, and you brought up immigration. So here's a good example. And go through the 7 cons, from neocon to popcon to compcon, and looking for common themes. Immigration is definitely a common theme, but none of them except FreeCon, I found, were willing to put it this way: 6 out of the 7, except for FreeCons, who emphasize freedom, they were all anti-immigration. They were all of the view. The NatCons would say something like it is hurting and diluting American nationality. You can see why they might argue for that. Others would argue for it's as you said, right? It's either ruining the welfare system or bankrupting the healthcare system or something like that. Or here's another one. This is Robert Reich or others would say something like it's bringing in low-priced labor that's undercutting the labor, the labor wages of the U.S. and stuff like that. Therefore, promoting inequality, whatever. That's a common theme here. And you could say that in the early colonial times, Alexander Hamilton was one of our greatest immigrants. And the whole argument that America was built on immigrants in part. I think it was built on freedom and constitutionalism, and that's why immigrants came. But if immigrants come, like in the 1890s, all the way up to World War II, because they're fleeing unfree countries and coming to our, then they want to be free. They go through Ellis Island, they get processed. I call it the Ellis Island model. I'm all for immigration as long as they're processed and we weed out criminals, terrorists, the sick, the contagious, right? And if you don't have a welfare state magnet, Milton Friedman pointed this out years ago. You get perfectly good immigrants if you process them and know who they are, and they're not running to the welfare office. The first place they run to is the language office. You know, they learn the language, and that's not what we have today. So it's a real dilemma. But many objectivists today will say, bring in as many immigrants and don't even have borders, and that's just ridiculous. Borders are part of the definition of the state. You know, it's what did Ayn Rand say? That institution that has a legal monopoly on the use of force in a particular territory. She says in a particular territory. That means there's borders. And doesn't mean they should be closed borders, doesn't mean they should be erased borders. This is a false alternative, right? That one side wants no borders, and they really want to ruin America. And the other side's answer is no borders, walls, hold the damn thing down. Don't. It's a false choice, isn't it?
I have long believed that conservatives don't get rid of the welfare state because they use it to rationalize for controls that they actually want.
Oh, like what?
Immigration is one of them. We can't let these immigrants in because of the welfare state.
Right.
They also will say the same thing about drugs. I mean, they complain about degeneracy, but they don't want to get rid of nothing that creates and subsidizes more degeneracy than the welfare state. I mean, the longer I live, the worse I think it is, and I there are certainly people out there who are, who just have bad luck, and I will give money to them now and then or whatever. But there's so much. It just creates so many problems, and they just don't want to touch it. But then they'll scream and shout about all the welfare that these immigrants take, and it's like, I get, it's not hard to figure out. If you don't want the pigeons to shit on your house and your car, don't put out the birdseed.
Uh,
A 6-year-old kid can figure that out.
I mean, part of it, Chris, I think part of it is what you said, namely electorally, by now, they're not going to come out against it because they'll lose elections. But I think you're right also that philosophically, morally, they don't really have a problem with it. They'll say something like this. We're all for charity and we're all for helping the poor. And they'll say it just should be voluntary. It just should be voluntary. And of course, a libertarian would say that. So if you say what I advocate, I like using the acronym VPC, voluntary private charity. I will always say to welfare status, left, right, and center, why not VPC? And they said, what's that? I said, voluntary private charity. It wouldn't be enough. There's too many. I said, what are you talking about? If you get rid of the welfare state, there is no distribution based on charity. Charity is totally privatized. Let's totally privatize charity. They won't do it. And even a religionist will say, I can't. I said, do you know how much is charitable giving now? The charitable giving now, not just because of tax breaks, is enormous, even with the confiscatory tax rates that people pay.
Yes.
If you reduce the size and scope of government, their tax burden is much less. You don't think they would give more to charity? And further, there wouldn't be as many charity cases because people would be more, independent and free and engaged in a prosperous livelihood. But I wrote something like this when Paul Ryan, do you remember this in the Paul Ryan days? Remember Paul Ryan?
Yes, Paul Ryan, the alleged fan of Ayn Rand. Yeah.
Right. And he was running mate of Romney.
Yes.
In 2000,
And don't forget, Obamacare started as Romney Care. Yeah, but yes.
he did, right. Yeah, right. Which he took, by the way, from guess which foundation? The Heritage Foundation, which is known as being conservative. Yes, up in Massachusetts. Romney's, I was a Massachusetts resident at the time, and Romney's decent argument, I thought, was people should not be freeloading on the system. That was his only good argument.
Yeah.
Instead of just saying get rid of the freeloaders, he said, well, the only way to get rid of the freeloaders is make them pay. So make everybody pay, which is not the right answer. But that was Heritage. That was Heritage not willing to say get rid of Medicare, Medicaid, the system that's causing this problem. Instead, just fix these other alleged Anyway, my point of bringing up Ryan is, and it goes back to your point about whether the conservatives, what their attitude is toward the welfare state. At that time, a Nancy Pelosi, a Catholic, Newt Gingrich, a Catholic, Joe Biden, a Catholic, there's a bunch of them, were criticizing Paul Ryan for not being Christian enough. So there's a Christian lever. And guess what their argument was? He was big on budget cutting, remember? He was gonna be like the David Stockman of our time. He was going to he had a plan. He issued a plan. Here's how to, rebalance the welfare state. Not dismantle the whole thing. Just bring it into balance. Like just stop the deficit spending, right? And so I thought it was very interesting because at the time they basically invoked his own philosophy and said, you hypocrite, you think you're a Christian, but look what you're doing. You're dispossessing the poor and you're ungodly. And how funny coming from the left. I thought you guys were the godless party. No, you're invoking God when it helps you. You're invoking Timothy and Anyway, I wrote a piece at the time for Forbes, and it ended up in my book, and it's called. People should look this up. You'll love it. Holy Scripture and the Welfare State. Holy Scripture and the Welfare State, where I quote chapter and verse, no pun intended, Scripture, which says not just that you should serve the poor and rich men don't enter the kingdom of heaven, they must therefore go to hell. Love of money is the root of all evil. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And here's the big leap. Does that mean we get a welfare state? I think we could argue philosophically that if people see something as a moral ideal, it ends up in politics. It ends up being something that's codified, whether the
Yeah.
religions want it or not. They'll say, we're all for altruism and welfareism as long as it's voluntary. And yet it always ends up being politically adopted because people think it's moral. So if objectivism comes along and says, that's actually not moral, so that's also not something government should be doing. But I think this contributes to it, Chris. And of the 7 cons listed, one common feature, they all have religion in them. I didn't find any that was secular. I didn't find any versions of con, even the free one that you would think mostly might be the free one might have, and we should also be secular. It does emphasize freedom, so it's the best of the cons. But it doesn't, but it still invokes religion. And so from that standpoint, none of the 7 cons, versions of con would in any way dent the welfare state.
I,
So,
I've long believed that Jesus was a good libertarian. Uh,
that he didn't invoke government to impose his views, you mean?
well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's.
But what did he say that was? Like, we never heard the share. Was that like a 50% share like we give now? Or maybe
Well,
it
he
was,
he was just, people just ask him about paying taxes, and give to yourself what's yourself.
yeah.
I don't,
Well, the tithe was what? 10%?
he was trying, he was trying to be coy about it, say it in a way that wouldn't get him in trouble with the authority, that
Right.
wouldn't make him treasonous,
Yeah. So he wouldn't be crucified.
and not to mention, Jesus lived in a time
Yeah.
in which entrepreneurialism did not really exist.
Uh-huh. Well, how does that?
Every in biblical times, up until well, what maybe up until the year 1500, everybody who got rich through the government in some way. It
Yeah,
was,
or the
everybody.
church.
It was all corporate welfare.
Yeah, or the church. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. So
Feudalism.
you didn't have people who really were entrepreneurial and self-made. It was.
Yeah. Not to be too irreligious here or anti-religious. I wanted to bring up very quickly that in the Tom Snyder interview that Ayn Rand gave just before she died, in 1979, I think, on TV, and she died a couple of years later. It's a great interview. Look at it. It's only like 30 minutes or so. You've probably seen it. But Tom Snyder had a late night show, a really erudite, really very good show. And it had all sorts of interesting people on, including Ayn Rand. And he's a Catholic. So one of his questions was about religion. And she gave a great answer. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. But Ayn Rand said something like, she said, I am not a militant atheist. I'm an atheist, but I'm not running around like Madeline O'Hare, the American atheist woman trashing religious people. And here's the key thing. She said something like, religion is a primitive form of philosophy. It gives you like canned answers to the big issues in life. It does deal with things like the nature of the universe. Okay, God started it eventually. It gives you a code of ethics, as they're called commandments. A whole bunch of suggestion of what government should be. Now, and she said, and so I'm for philosophy. She said, I'm a philosopher. I'm advocate. People need philosophy. And she said, but this is a primitive form of primitive. She meant pre-enlightenment. You know, and she said, we need enlightened philosophy. We need a rational secular philosophy. And so I've often thought of that. I thought of it and I quote it a lot when I talk to conservative students who are religious, because I don't want to, just smash them over the head because they have religion, because I always look at it as you have a philosophy. Now let's talk about how rational that philosophy is. But the idea of philo, love of wisdom, is a good thing. And so I think that's really important, and it's a way for objectivists or any atheists, I suppose, and as long as they're philosophical, to bridge to this group. That it's a understandable thing, and the only competition they have, and the thing they feed off of, well, other than objectivism, they shouldn't be anti-objectivism, because we're for philosophy too, we're for ethics too, we're for morality too. Is nihilism. Right? That's what they see on campus. That's what they see these guys shooting Charlie Kirk. I just want to destroy. I believe in nothing. So you could see why the religionist Chris would say, well, we believe in something. And the objectivists would say, we believe in something, but it's not belief based, it's rational based. And I've often thought, if that's the choice they're looking at, I get it. If the choice that religionists are looking at is these nihilists, I will say that religion is better than nothing. And it's truly nothing. I mean, nihilism means ex nihilo means nothing. The nihilism means nothingness. And you see why, again, a false choice. You can see why a religionist would say, given a choice between nothing and I'm worthless in life, and I'm the kind of person who wants to take a rifle and shoot anything, not just anything, something, not just something really important and something influential like Charlie Kirk and TPUSA. So the nihilists who claim, I don't believe in anything, don't just like skulk away and go to a basement somewhere and kill themselves. They get really angry and anxious and bothered about something that's especially something that's really important, and go out and try to kill it. So that's where I'm sympathetic to the religionists. I want to bring them toward a more rational philosophy. But I get it why they look at these nihilists and say, we don't want that. Of course you don't want that. And they feed off each other, right? The nihilists will say, look at these religionists, they're wackos, they're supernaturalists, but they're better than a nihilist. If that makes any sense. I don't know if you've ever thought of it that way.
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, there's a lot of nihilism. I've always thought it was nihilism, but yeah, you say it's nihilism. I mean, just this worship of nothing. I mean, I don't know where we go from here. It's because it seems like people just don't have a purpose. There's a lot of, I mean, I mean, life expectancy in America has actually been going down since 2014, and the decline of birth rates and other things. Just, I don't know if you ever heard of the mouse utopia experiment, but
No.
they put the mice in perfect conditions where they had all the food, no predators, and they ended up multiplying, but then eventually they reversed and just became completely antisocial, and
Uh-huh.
the mice became extinct
Hmm.
because things were just too easy for them. I don't know if sometimes I wonder if all the wealth we have has just made people lose purpose, because maybe the fact that people don't have to go out and fight for survival every day just leaves them with nothing to do.
I've heard that theory before, and actually some of the founders, Adams particularly, had that theory. I can't say that I endorse it, but it's plausible. It goes, you've heard this, Chris. It goes something like this. And the way Adams put it was, um, if we have a free society, which we're trying to establish here as at the founding, and it becomes prosperous, peaceful,
Yes.
then people and opulent, they used to call it opulent. Then people now here they're thinking of aristocrats sitting around, doing nothing on their estates. And then he's thinking that will make them soft. That will make them untested with the trials and tribulations of life. That will make them complacent. and that will make them inclined to give up their liberties. And then the whole cycle will occur. Then things will go badly. Then they'll be either at war and poverty, and then they'll be fighting themselves back because there's this instinct for self-preservation in humans, and back again toward. I've heard that, and I think you're picking up. There are modern
Yes.
versions of this as a strong men lead to. You heard this sequence? Will lead to blah blah blah. I can't remember the sequence.
Strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. Yeah.
Wow, there it is. Okay, there it is. So you think there's something to that?
I wonder if it is that case, because I often think that the virtue of America was just the simple fact that people had to work so hard to get here, and then once they got here, they had to work so hard just to build a civilization, and maybe the best maybe the best way to create a new America is just to go colonize a planet. I mean, if I had Elon's money, I would certainly be putting my money into that. Let's colonize a planet and then leave all these other losers behind.
It is interesting because there's years ago, Eric Daniels, the great objectivist historian, told me about the Whig theory of history, not WIG, WHIG, and the Whigs were British libertarians.
Yes.
And I said, what is that interpretation? He said the Whig interpretation of history is ever onward, always getting better. And he said it was dominant at one point. And I said, how could that ever be dominant after the Dark Ages, right? Because we had the Greco-Roman civilization. Then we clearly went in decline for 1,000 years before we had the Renaissance and Enlightenment. So that alone would throw out the track record of ever upward, ever onward. But I do believe, give me a modified Whig theory that says conditionally, so long as men remain rational and self-interested, why can't it be ever upwards? Why would we have this cycle of improvement and then decline? And so I don't think it's inevitable that we have this cycle of improvement and then decline and then improvement again. I think the reason people see it, and they do see that, like the reason they see it is that the cultures of the world are not full-fledged 100% pro-reason, pro-egoism, pro-individualism. I mean, we know there's mixed systems, including mixed philosophic premises. Is that causing the cycle? Instead of, it's inevitable or just part of human advancement isn't sustainable is what this argument is, which troubles me. It kind of sounds like Marx saying capitalism isn't sustainable because there's exploitation, or the Greens saying capitalism isn't sustainable because of the wrecking the planet. And now here it is that capitalism isn't sustainable because it's very good for neophytes starting out, building up themselves. But then it leaves us with these plutocrats or recipient heirs. What do they call them? Worthless heirs of wealthy people who never earned a thing in their life. And now they're, like take George Soros' son, Alex. George Soros himself is terrible, but at least he made his money. He's terrible because then he spent it on Antifa and other terrible causes. But then his son, Alex, who hasn't done a damn thing, takes his fortune and now he's going to start giving it to left-wing causes. Is that due to capitalism? I would think it's due to George Soros' son was taught socialism and fascism. And you know what I'm saying? And he could have been Charles Koch's son. If he's taught libertarianism. Or take Larry, what's his name? Larry Ellison? Oracle.
Yes.
Friendly to objectivism, loves Ayn Rand's works. I don't know that he's given much philanthropy to the objectivist cause, but Larry Ellison's son, is it Paul? Paul Ellison now is putting together a media empire, right-wing bought, Paramount, bought, is it CBS? I think he's building a rival network to Fox. So the heirs don't have to be the socialists or, anti-capitalist. They don't have to be, my point. But I think it is a very intriguing theory of is hardship necessary to really achieve? And then does opulence and softness lead to complacency and losing everything the preconditions for how you succeeded? It's a good question.
It is hard to say. One lady I had on, she said, she said the big mistake was just having staff, and that you have to make kids do chores and stuff like that.
Yes, I remember chores. Yeah, chores, Chris, or summer job.
chores, like, like taking out the trash, cleaning the kitchen, and stuff like that.
Yes, setting the table. Yeah, we had chores. I mean, I was one of 7 kids, so we had to have chores. But yeah, my mother made us do it, and it was good, and we'll cut the lawn and stuff like that. And but also summer jobs. I mean, I know the economy has changed. I know people have options, but I am so old fashioned. I'll ask students when they come back, I'll say, what was your summer job? Oh, I didn't have a summer job. I roamed around Europe or something like that. That's very nice. Very cool. I'm in the investment business and academia, so I have this kind of life of the mind and research and stuff like that. But my summer jobs were in lumberyard. I loved it. I didn't want to be inside, in some line.
Oh, yeah.
I was out and getting sunburned, hauling lumber around, putting on the back of trucks, smelling sawdust in the morning. It was awesome, but very physicalist. But
Yeah.
I would watch these entrepreneur, lumber company owners, and they were just amazing. And I would meet these builders, and I'd meet these architects, and and I was like thin as a rail and bronzed, and that was my summer job. Loved it.
In a lumber yard, you said?
Yeah, lumber yards. In general.
Okay, because well, you were not because not only that, logging is actually statistically, the deadliest job you can have.
Oh no, I wasn't the
Far.
log.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
falling trees and all that stuff. That's the job that kills more workers than anybody.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, and it's by far. I mean,
Wow. By the way, this may seem completely unrelated, but I have to
Yeah.
convey a great adage I heard recently from Dennis Prager, who has had an awful, tragic accident, semi-paralyzed. But
It's awful. I didn't know about that. Yeah.
he fell in. I won't go into the details, but after Charlie Kirk was killed, believe it or not, this relates to logging. After Charlie Kirk was killed, he was interviewed briefly, and he said something very profound I had never heard before. And he said, sometimes they say in the logging business, that's how he started it. In the logging business out in Oregon and elsewhere, they'll say, you never know how high a tree is until it falls. Isn't that great? So in other words, Charlie Kirk, only when he fell and you see, wow, look at what did he do? Look at the influence. I love that. That could be said of any giant, right, who dies. And why don't we fully see what they did while they were alive, but you see it in retrospect. So anyway, that's what I think of when you talk about logging. I didn't think of industrial accidents. I thought of what Prager said.
Yeah.
And I say before I know you probably want to wrap up soon, but if I wanted to get this on the record because
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier Rand in 1960 gave a talk at Princeton called Conservatism, an Obituary. And I wanted to name 3. But by the way, when I read this, my parents were conservatives. I read this, I think, when in 1979 or so. And when I read Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So it's one of the chapters in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which came out in 66, I think. So it was one of the essays. The Princeton speech went into the book. And what's interesting is in the intervening years, Goldwater lost in a landslide to LBJ, as we know. And she was pro Goldwater. He would today be called a free con, where his emphasis was on freedom and liberty. Remember, he famously said when he was being accused of being an extremist, he said, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in pursuit of virtue is no.
In the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
No virtue, yeah, which was great. But I just wanted to kind of get on the record because this is a discussion of conservatism. She said there's 3 things about American conservatism, which are either disqualifying or is going to rob them of any momentum or any ultimate power. And the first one she said is they have this view that man is depraved. He's a sinner. He's fallen from the Garden of Eden, and James Madison famously said in one of the Federalist Papers, were men angels, we wouldn't need government. Remember that one? If men were angels, angelic, Christian,
Yes.
we wouldn't need government, which is interesting. So we only need government. Why? Because men are devils. They could be devilish. They might sin. So she said, you can't do that. She said, first of all, that men are not, there's nothing, there's no original sin in men. They're not like pre-wired to do badly unless you have laws against them. And she said, but they will if they're not rational. So you should. But the other thing she said, now moving on to epistemology, she said the other thing is it's faith-based. Conservatism, she says, heavily religious, heavily faith-based. And she said, she put it in the negative. She said something like, look what you're doing. You're conceding that the other side has good rational arguments. That
Yeah.
socialism, is based on science and reason and facts and logic but you're going to go by faith, revelation, and feelings. She said, talk about giving up the argument. Terrible.
Yeah.
And then the last one, I think what was the last one? Tradition. She just said, just invoking the past because it's custom or it's tradition. The past includes a whole bunch of good and bad. It can't be true because it's old.
Yeah.
And we know the other side thinks it's true because it's new. It's fresh and new and shiny. It must be true. That's
Yeah.
not. So that's not an objective standard, she said. Yeah. So I think it's interesting because that's a long time ago, right? That's 65 years ago.
Yeah, and that's something, there's a lot of people, who just have this attitude. Something
Yeah.
is good. Something is that new is always better. And, I do wonder a lot about human nature, Richard, because I just,
Uh-huh.
after COVID, it just,
Yeah.
it really makes me wonder if you could manipulate, two groups of people into hating each other and just do it with propagandizing them enough, because I said, well, what about all the people who wanted to kill me for not taking a vaccine? It's,
I know.
and I never did anything to them. And it's
Right. But I don't think it's human nature. I think this was taught. Yeah, there's a lot of teaching. One side was you're anti-vax. No, how about I'm okay with vax, but don't force it on me. Is that simple enough for you? I mean, why is that so difficult?
yes,
And
yeah.
it is. It is.
Talking.
Here's another thing you might like.
Yeah.
Because I like to identify if a student says, "My body, my choice" on abortion, right?
Yes.
And as a libertarian objectivist and individualist, I'll say, I agree. I said, so what about the jab? What about the jab? Oh, no, we should force the jab. So what happened to my body, my choice?
Yeah.
How about the government doesn't decide what to put in your body or take out of your body? How about that? Including organs.
Yeah.
Like, why can't there be a free market in organ transplants? Oh, that's awful.
Yeah.
That's horrendous. Sometimes if you just mark the consistency, the logic of an argument, if they still care about logic, then that can help. You can point out things like this, or the famous libertarian bumper sticker. I'm pro-choice on everything. I'm not just pro-choice. I'm pro-choice on everything. How about that? Can we be consistent about it? So, I think the other thing that's happening, Chris, is Marxism, which began as capitalist versus labor, when about the turn of the century, 1900 or so, when they realized labor was actually doing pretty well under capitalism, the socialists shifted to, instead of revolution, they advocated evolution. So instead of by bullets, it would be by ballots. Let's vote for socialism, even if it comes in gradually. It was very popular in Britain, evolutionary socialism. And so, but that required, a lot of them were writing at the time, they said, you know what, that's going to require teaching people in schools to want socialism, because otherwise they won't vote for it. They're not going to vote for it, in other words, based just on the labor being impoverished, right? But we know, if you know from cultural Marxism, that the other approach would be to shift the whole antagonism from, well, I guess it's not capitalist versus labor, but it's men versus women, or it's gays versus straight, right? Or it's capitalism versus the planet, and so, or it's the foreigners and immigrants versus domestic. So it's almost like their goal is keep the antagonisms flowing, concoct new ones if necessary. And it's Marxism, but it's in the form of all these other potential antagonisms. So I think of that when you say, boy, they seem perpetually able to put people at each other's throats. And why is that? It's done over COVID, or it's done over, whatever, welfare reform, or it is very common. But I think that's one of the roots of it. There's people out there who want to divide, and frankly, it's the old style, divide and conquer.
Yes.
And so to divide and conquer, you have to think of divisions. You have to think of cleavages.
Yeah. One other thing too is, since we're been talking about conservatism, this recent hit piece by Politico that came out and said, oh, these people were making jokes. And of course, Politico is a lefty rag, and it's just, it was a private conversation that went public. It would be like, if I published, if I'd recorded the conversation we had, before we started recording. Uh, I don't give any credence to these leaked conversations, number one, but number two, it's like, you immediately see some of these Republicans, oh, we condemn this. But I was glad to see that there were a lot more people like Matt Walsh and other people pushing back, said, no, don't apologize for this. Don't. So at least the appeasement is finally going away. I mean,
Yeah.
which is why conservatives lost so much, is because they were always giving in to these people, just saying,
Yeah.
we don't.
Yeah.
So that is nice to see. I'm glad to see that. Kind of glad to see that happen.
That's it. Yeah, I don't know the controversy particularly about political, but I heard it was about private messages and stuff like that. So, how representative are. But I do have a take on what you just said, because I've noticed the same thing, and I like this about the current crop of whatever conservatives, compared to what do they used to call it? The country club Republicans, the white shoed Republicans of the 50s and 60s.
Yes, the country Republican.
What was also, Chris, was also called Me Too Republicans. Me Too was what we were talking about earlier, where the Democrats would come up with something, and Republicans would say, "Okay, me too. I'll go along."
Well, also, you gotta, when
But
I had
what I wanted to point out was, I think you're onto something, and I've noticed it too. It's in J.D. Vance, it's in Ben Shapiro, it was in Charlie Kirk, maybe it's in Matt Walsh. It can be religious, but here's what I noticed: they're loud and proud. They are call it combative without using fisticuffs. The pugnacious conservatives, the ones willing to, as Teddy Roosevelt said, enter the arena and engage in a battle, literally to risk your life if necessary, to be murdered.
yeah,
A whole bunch of college students. And that is very different. That is not Bill Buckley in his studio, pontificating and using 25-cent words to sound important. I do like that. I don't think they're as intellectual, so they need to be intellectual, but they're definitely pugnacious, and they're definitely intellectually pugnacious, and maybe even politically so. And I think actually some of the objectivists are misinterpreting this as they're all they're authoritarians. No, they're louder and prouder and maybe more male, not to gender it, but they're more masculine, and they're more willing to, in the good sense of, be bold, be courageous. I've often said people should remember the not the Pledge of Allegiance, the national anthem ends with the land of the free and the home of the brave. Cannot have freedom without bravery. And the image of the male, you and I talked off record earlier about that great book by, what's her name? Christina
Hoff Sommers. Yeah.
Hoff Sommers, The War on Boys, years ago. She was saying in the elementary schools and elsewhere, mostly coming from feminism, this attack on boys from a very early age. Toxic masculinity. Toxic. I mean, can you imagine if men were running around saying toxic femininity?
Oh yeah.
They can denounce the literally masculinity per se as dangerous, as toxic. So that has not helped. But anyway, on the bright side, I have noticed that there is much more willingness to engage, to debate. When Charlie Kirk went to these campuses, he would specifically ask for objectors and opponents to go to the front of the line. And then he would usually embarrass them anyway, because he was self-taught, and even being self-taught, he knew more than most kids did in college, which is saying something. And so that example of, I've done my homework, I'm willing to stand up in the public and debate this, and I'm not going to shy away from that, and I'm not going to use Queensberry rules of war. The polite approach. And so there's some swearing going on. There's some cursing going on. It should be a little more intellectual, but I like it. And they're young. They're young and combative. And that combination, Chris, with a more objective and more consistently pro-capitalist message would be so powerful. It'd be amazing. By the way, I wanted to say something also about why I think Trump is hated. And I don't think it's just personality. And I don't even think this is a conspiracy theory. I think one of the reasons and one of the good parts of his conservatism, which is not the protectionist stuff, It's the argument, I'm against forever wars. If you remember, one of the reasons he wiped out the Bushes in 2016, Jeb Bush, is
Yeah.
not just low energy Jeb, but he was attacking the Iraq war. He was saying that was ridiculous, that the Iraq war was ridiculous, and so he has this view, which has not typically been the conservative view, that the US should not be policemen of the world, that the US should not be making the world safe for democracy, as Wilson said, all these Democrats said, and get us into all these wars, let alone wars that go on and on and on, and then at the end of the day, we lose them, like
Yeah.
Vietnam, like Afghanistan, 20 years in Afghanistan, and they end up with the Taliban anyway. I mean, that kind of stuff. And so that's the good part of his wing. He is against the neocons. I mentioned the neocons is one of them. That former Democrats who became disillusioned with the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s and moved over into the Republican camp. But the neocons tended to be warmongers. I mean, they tend to be all at one, like McCain. We call them McCainiacs. They wanted to be the U.S. involved in every war possible instead of ending wars or withdrawing. And so him even questioning NATO as not a defensive alliance, but possibly an offensive one. I think that's one of the reasons that caused the Russians to get upset about, is NATO going to take in Afghanistan and not Afghanistan, Ukraine? That's what Biden was promising. Anyway, I think that's been the good element of Trump. And I think it's one of the reasons he's hated. I do believe, I never believed this 20 years ago. I believe there is something called the military industrial media complex that does want
Yeah.
war, naturally. And not just that, I think they actually want the wars to go on and America to lose because there's no end to the defense spending.
They just want, yeah.
The turnstile of going from the Pentagon to the munitions makers to the Pentagon and back again. I don't think it's due to capitalism. I think it's totally due to statism and imperialism. But to the extent Trump is against that, they hate him. They hate him for that. The media would hate him for that. The makers would hate him for
Yeah.
that. And the Pentagon doesn't like him for that. I mean,
They don't.
he apparently said, get out of Afghanistan in the first term. And they
Yeah.
wouldn't. They literally defied his supposed to be civilian,
Yeah.
civilian control of the military, right? What's this guy?
Oh, yeah.
Milley and all those guys opposed him and frog walked it and won out in the end because then he was he was deposed. So they didn't
Yeah.
have and then they got out of Afghanistan under Biden. But what do you think of that, Chris? I mean, there is hate.
I've always believed that's one thing that war was always the main issue that mattered to conservatives. I think I think they wanted something like the Cold War. They just wanted to have an argument to spend it. They didn't want actual war because war is very destructive. But
Yeah.
I mean, they don't ever. I mean, I think what's going. I mean, technically speaking, North Korea and South Korea are still at war, but
Yeah.
because it's just a ceasefire and. I
And
think
we
they
still-
want
and we
they
still
want
have-
something like that though, where there's all this money spent to fortify this.
We still have troops there.
Not to mention, too, as I do think there's at least some a lot of the young men too. He's not really accepted at all by conservatives, but to his credit, some of these people realize why Andrew Tate is popular with young men is because he doesn't apologize for being what he is, and he has this attitude that if you want to do something, go out and do it. Don't be a coward.
Yeah.
And that appeals to young.
If any of this includes the message, where they think it does, some of them is, be a father, be a dad. You don't have to have kids. I actually don't like the, admonition of we should have, you're obligated to go have more kids and raise a family. And I don't think that's true. But if you do, yeah, the whole idea of bastardized children and broken families and the welfare state
Oh, yeah.
being married to the state and instead of being married to your girl or your guy is terrible. And so admonitions that men be men in the sense of live up to your obligations, but women should do the same thing. That's a good message. I mean, to the extent the conservatives have that message, I'm not even against their message of family is important, nuclear family is important. Yeah, we have choice in America, but it's undeniable. Thomas Sowell has showed this. Walter Williams used to show this. Bill Bennett has showed it. It is undeniable that unless the family unit is intact, you're going to get a lot of delinquency. You're going to get a lot of crime.
Yeah.
You get a lot of drugs. That's just a fact. It has nothing to do with racism. I mean, it has to do with behavioral issues. And so the conservatives tend to be pretty good on that, I think.
I sometimes worry that they're trying to make crime a racial issue, but I certainly think they need to talk about boys without dads.
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
there's
Also,
things that
what-
boys I think get subconscious. on a
Yeah. Well, certainly if they're being called toxic.
yeah, you need, there are things that boys get on a subconscious level from their dads, and
Yeah.
it's like, it reminds me of that guy said, when I wish my dad had been around because, when I was getting involved with the gangs, he would have kicked my ass. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
there is
Yeah.
kind of that element involved. It's
It's
giving.
not just that, Chris. Have you ever heard? I've heard this so often. I think, wow, that sounds like a dad thing. It's usually an athlete. And it's usually like an NFL player or NBA player, and he's being interviewed, and he didn't have a dad in the house. But then he'll say something like, "If I messed up, mom would kick my ass."
Yeah,
I've seen this so many times. I'm sure it's not just anecdotal that these guys succeeded because mom was so tough. At least, you know what I'm saying? You see that a lot.
yeah, you
So
see that sometimes, too, and just or they might have grandpa or an uncle or somebody like that in their life too. It's yeah, they want there are some tough moms out there. It's no doubt about that.
I want to say something good also about the conservatives post Charlie Kirk. Now, this will be somewhat controversial. And I tried this on students and they thought it was controversial, but I said something like, in the wake of George Floyd being killed, mass riots. So we know what happened, summer of
Yeah,
2020. And the claim that the cops are racist, which wasn't even in the trial record, by the way. They weren't accused of that at all. Uh, and the DA, the black Muslim DA of Minnesota, didn't even bring those charges because there was no evidence. Okay, that's neither here nor there. The point is, George Floyd was kind of made a saint, and he was passing bad money. I mean, he was committing a crime and he was on drugs and stuff like that.
yeah. George Floyd was a
Doesn't
horrible
mean
creature.
doesn't mean he should be killed, but also I think shouldn't be given sainthood. Anyway, the reaction is that I wanted to bring out was this: Charlie Kirk gets murdered. Charlie Kirk is actually a formidable, as I said, the symbolism of it, and will affect things in the future way more than
Yeah,
George Floyd's death. And peace, right?
yeah, peace.
Vigils.
People
No,
having vigils. People.
no. Instead of defund the police, why wasn't there defund the universities? None of
Yeah,
that. None of that was there. And now, when you look at his memorial, one way of interpreting this would be the Christians do have this view, especially New Testament. Turn the other cheek. You don't meet violence with violence.
yeah,
It's not the Old Testament. The Jews would have a different view, a different take on it. But now, am I a Christian? No. Do I believe the Christian faith actually made Christians more peaceful in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk? Yeah, I think it's undeniable.
yeah.
And it's not something any objectivist would say because to them it sounds like you're endorsing Christianity. No, I'm not. And as I said earlier, I'm not even happy with Erica Kirk saying she'd forgive the murderer. That's not justice. That's mercy.
I
And if the courts went that way, we'd have more murderers. So I'm sure I
Yeah,
assume she knows that. But she's the grieving widow. I'm not going to criticize her too much here.
yeah,
But see how that would also lead to basically people saying, we're not going to revenge this in the streets, even though we could. We're not going to do what they did in 2020. That's very interesting. I don't think the other side looks at it and says, wow, you guys are actually better than us because we're kind of savages in the wake of people who are killed on our side. I don't know what our side means. What, you're on the side of criminals and drug addicts? It's ridiculous.
yeah. That's
So do you notice that difference and the reason and why?
this is one thing too. And I've often said that Charlie Kirk's death, took all the attention away from Marina Zarutska in
Oh,
Charlotte.
I know.
And but I am curious to know what might a group of conservatives do, let's say, if a judge lets that guy walk.
I know. Well,
Because I think people are getting fed up enough with crime, that they want to believe in the system and they'll give the system a chance, but they're realizing now that this guy never should have been on the street.
yeah, and by the way, if you tie it together with the kid who killed the healthcare executive on the streets of New York,
Yeah,
notice the pattern not only issuing these stupid manifestos where something happens and the first thing people do is, well, what do they believe and who are they allied with and who are they surfing on the web beforehand? I just heard CNN or someone the other day saying, well, it's a little too early to say. We're not really quite sure what the motive is. And I thought to myself, not only do they write these manifestos to make it clear, they are literally etching their intentions on the bullet casings. Like, hello, I'm an Antifa, I'm an Antifa wacko, and this is why I'm killing Charlie, and they still won't.
Yeah.
So encasing the stuff on and putting it on the casings is so symbolic to me. But
Yeah.
by the way, Chris, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark.
Yeah. I was thinking about we ought to get to
I just wanted to say something that might help to kind of wrap up what I found as I'm researching these conservatives. I have this short little list of what I found in common among all the 7 cons, which I think is
Yes.
one of them is they're all for democracy. They do tout democracy, which Ayn Rand said is a form of collectivism, a majority rule. Only the free cons. No, it has to be constitutionally limited.
Well, yeah.
Second one is religion. We already talked about that. They're almost all religious. And related to that, they'll all say rights come from God. I mean, they'll say it doesn't come from the state. We agree with that too. But we would say it comes from human nature. It comes from the nature of humans. But so they'll say rights come from God. The other common element I thought was populism. Most of them are populists, anti-elitist. And then the last one was altruism. They're very much in the view that service to others and self-sacrifice is a good thing. But the last one is won't use capitalism. They will not use the word capitalism because they think it either sounds like a Marxist, that came from Marx, which it didn't, or that it's the system for capitalists, for these rich people. We can't be for that because we're populists, we're anti-elite. And, a lot of them are for antitrust, like Josh Hawley and others. They're for big, beat up on big business. So that's part populism, but I think it's also interesting. They won't use the word capitalism. But Ayn Rand said that 65 years ago. They won't use that word. They use free enterprise. They think it's only about economics. And that's something where we're different as well, right? I'm advocating capitalism and I'm saying it's moral. And I'm saying morality means rational egoism, not altruism.
Yeah. This is what bothers me. I remember years ago, I made a small sign that just said laissez-faire, and I went to a Tea Party rally, and hardly anybody there knew what that meant. That really bothered me. It's like,
yeah, right.
I don't know. And I think a lot of those Tea Party people kind of became what's now considered the MAGA coalition. I don't know where it's going to go from here, but hopefully we'll end up, hopefully this will work out. We're 2 hours. You have anything else to say before we go, Richard?
Well, other than plugging my book, yeah. So, well, 2 things. One, people should read. It's really very good. Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? So that's available on Amazon. While you're at Amazon, down below you'll see another thing much shorter because Where Have All the Capitalists Gone is fairly long, but you'll love the essays. It integrates objectivism and free market economics and constitutionally limited government arguments. But then I have something called the Pocket Guide to Capitalism. That's a quick read. That is a condensed version of all aspects of capitalism, which people love. It's you can get it in Kindle, I think. Yeah, both of them can get them in Kindle, but definitely if you don't have the time, Pocket Guide to Capitalism is maybe 30 pages, 35 pages.
Yep.
And easily digestible, but it's very condensed. It's the economics, the politics, the psychology, the history of capitalism in these very short little vignettes. So other than that, richardsalsman.com.
richardsalsman.com. And that reminds me, when we were talking about COVID, the only prominent business person I heard come out against the COVID restrictions was David Neeleman, the guy who founded JetBlue.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was nobody else. Not even Cuban was. Not even Mark Cuban was coming out against him.
Right. Wow. Okay.
But anyway, please like the show, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel Escape from the Village, check out my Substack. People are giving me money at buymeacoffee.com. Thank you, Richard Salsman. This has been a great show. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel Escape from the Village from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.